The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP aims to improve the quality of reporting on Africa-China relations through reporting grants, workshops, and other opportunities for journalists. More information at africachinareporting.co.za and our dedicated training website at africachinatraining.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus Van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good morning to you, Cobus.
Good morning.
Cobus, the year began with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi doing his five-nation week-long tour in Africa. Right away, after about 48 hours, the guy turned right back around and made a four-nation tour here in my neighborhood in Southeast Asia through four ASEAN countries. And it really raised the point that ASEAN now is becoming a much bigger priority for the Chinese. And really, especially now that the pressure coming from the United States is intensifying in terms of trade, and the diplomatic relationships are very contentious with Europe. The Chinese are definitely focusing a lot more attention on ASEAN. And it's interesting, Cobus, because ASEAN has a lot of parallels with Africa, and that's one of the reasons why we want to talk about it today. And they have a lot of experience, probably more than anybody, in dealing with the Chinese, given that they're at the doorstep of the Chinese and they've been here forever. And so we thought today what we'd like to do is take a look at how ASEAN has been managing its relationship with China and also the United States, and what lessons there might be for African countries who are struggling to figure out their place in this new era that we're in between the United States and China. Before we get started, let me just kind of introduce everybody to ASEAN in case people aren't familiar. It's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It's a 10-country bloc made up of about 650 million people. It's a very young region with about a third of the population under the age of 19. Now, it's also an extremely diverse region that's home to the world's largest Muslim country in Indonesia, a Catholic country in the Philippines. Here in Vietnam, where I am, it's a mix of Catholicism and Buddhism. There are also hundreds of languages and dialects that are spoken. So in many ways, it is very similar to Africa in the sense that it's very fragmented and very diverse. Now, economically speaking, it's an absolute powerhouse. Total GDP last year, about $2.3 trillion. In 2020, the ASEAN bloc became China's largest trading partner with about $732 billion in two-way trade. That puts it ahead of its number two partner, the European Union, even ahead of the United States, Japan, and South Korea. Also for the United States, it's the fourth largest export market for American goods, and two-way trade last year came in at around $323 billion. But it's also still a very poor part of the world. And that's something very, very important to remember. It's still largely an agrarian economies here. Per capita income averaged across the 10 countries at just over $4,000. So something to keep in mind there. Now, Cobus, right now the awareness of ASEAN countries in Africa is rather low, but that may be changing a bit, especially where you are in South Africa. Last November, the South African government became the first sub-Saharan African country to become an ASEAN partner when it signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation at the ASEAN Summit in Hanoi. So that was really interesting how South Africa, in many ways, is looking beyond China in its Asia strategy to see this giant market of 650 million people. Now, more importantly for our discussion today, this is a region, again, as I mentioned, has more experience in dealing with China than any other part of the world. So there may be some lessons here for people in other developing regions like Africa and what they can learn and what it's like to live, again, at the doorstep of China.
Yes, one of the issues, of course, is that ASEAN is really core Belt and Road country. So there's a lot to learn from both the successes and the failures of Belt and Road projects in different ASEAN countries. It's also, I think, really important for Africa to take note of ASEAN because it is this incredibly diverse region with several quite poor countries that collectively have kind of managed to position itself as a very powerful bloc. And, that is the underlying agenda of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement as well, is this idea of kind of collectivity, kind of equal strength. And another thing that really is key is the level of intra-ASEAN trade, which is much, much higher than the level of intra-African trade. And I think many African countries look at ASEAN as a kind of a holy grail in terms of neighbors trading with each other and kind of moving the entire region up the value chain. I think this is one of the key reasons why South Africa is also so interested in ASEAN.
Yeah, it's interesting because for a long time, China has been trying to present itself as a development model for African countries. And in many ways, I never really saw that fit, only because China's political history, its dynamics, the fact that it's so large, are really not compatible at all in many ways with the African experience and the African situation. Whereas, as you pointed out, ASEAN is a very different situation here. These are fragmented countries, very different from one another, don't speak the same language, very agrarian based, and there are a lot of parallels. And for a long time, I've been looking for the right guest to join us to be able to talk about how it is here in this part of the world and the relationship with China, and I found it. In the Dragon's Shadow, Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century is a new book by Sebastian Strangio, who is also the Southeast Asia editor at the Asia Pacific News website, The Diplomat. If you haven't picked up this book, I highly recommend it. In the Dragon's Shadow, Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century. A very good evening in Adelaide, Australia. Sebastian, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Eric. It's good to be here.
Well, we gave a brief introduction as to what ASEAN is, how dynamic this region is. Your book really covers most of the region. You didn't get to all 10 countries, but you got to most. And you really took us on a travel journey. And I think there's two companion books, by the way, that I want to recommend to people while reading this book, Southeast Asia and the Chinese Century. Also, Jonathan Hillman's book on the Belt and Road, who we spoke with earlier on this show. And then also Howard French did a book on the tributary relationship historically that China's had in this part of the world. So I thought those books together all complement what you've been writing about. So before we get into the specific countries, because I'd like to go through one by one a few of the countries to get some of your insights. Give us the high-level overview of this part of the world and how it relates with China.
Well, I mean, the main, condition, I suppose, that underpins Southeast Asia's relationship with China is, of course, geographic proximity. I mean, these two regions have been linked to each other, in various ways for centuries. Large parts of Southeast Asia, particularly the continental parts of Southeast Asia that are territorially contiguous with China, lay within the orbit of China's tributary system as, for long periods of history. Of course, it was never as cohesive as it might seem, but, China's influence in this region was quite considerable. In addition to that, you had ethnic Chinese traders who sailed out from China's shores, particularly from the southern parts of what is today China, and traded with the region. Many of them settled in the region. And so you sort of have a pattern of interaction which goes back really centuries. And, as a result, Southeast Asia has been one of the first regions to feel the effect of China's reemergence as a serious power in the region. It has experienced massive flows of investment capital. We've seen, large numbers of Chinese expatriates and business people moving to the region, tourists coming to the region from China in increasing numbers. And really, it's, China's economic, political, even cultural power, is now having a profound impact on the region's development.
It's interesting because so many of the anecdotes that you talk about in the individual stories from the different countries are many of the same themes that are common in Africa. So there is issues of Chinese labor, Chinese loans, Chinese infrastructure, managing the U.S.-China relationship. And so what I'd like to do now is let's go through 5 countries and let's see if there are lessons that can emerge from what's going on here for people in other parts of the world. So you talked about the border states. Let's start with Vietnam. Vietnam has a very complex relationship with China, and this really highlights the lack of any binary way of looking at a China relationship. On the one hand, it's a border country, it's the largest trading partner, the Chinese culture is pervasive here. This is a country that China ruled as a tributary state for 1,000 years. But at the same time, the last war that Vietnam had was with China. It has a very tense relationship today over disputed islands in the East Vietnam Sea, South China Sea. Tell us a little bit about the Vietnam-China relationship and how you would define it.
I think it can be summed up pretty well by Freud's idea of the narcissism of small differences. To a large extent, Vietnam, but by quite some margin, is the nation in Southeast Asia that's been most profoundly imprinted by Chinese culture and civilization. In the section of my book on Vietnam, I note, I describe the irony that sits at the core of Vietnamese history, which is that all of the borrowed things that the country's absorbed from China, including during periods of direct imperial rule, have equipped Vietnam in many ways with the tools necessary to maintain, establish its independence and to preserve that independence from repeated Chinese incursions. And this irony, this sense of closeness shadowed by hostility, continues through to the present. I mean, you see it today reflected in the fact that the two countries are both ruled by communist parties, which have a very similar system of Leninist Confucianism. And of course, China helped support the Vietnamese Revolution and, the eventual unification of the country under Vietnamese rule in 1975. And so, the two communist parties have very close relationships, and they have similar interests in maintaining their power in a post-communist world. By the same token, the two nations find themselves at odds in the South China Sea, where the Spratly and Paracel Islands have acted as a sort of conduit for a deeply rooted anti-Chinese wellspring within Vietnam. And of course, of all the nations in ASEAN, the public opinion polling in Vietnam, shows the most stridently negative views of China. I mean, I spoke with people there, numerous people there, and I didn't hear anyone say really anything good about China. There was, and I think that this poses a very, difficult challenge for the Communist Party in Hanoi, because they rely increasingly on China for imports, for trade. A lot of the manufacturing industries in Vietnam rely on components that are manufactured north of the border, and so there's this constant tension as a Vietnamese scholar told me, the Vietnamese government finds itself pressed between the Vietnamese people and the Chinese state. And so, I think that Vietnam is in some ways in one of the most challenging positions of any nation in Southeast Asia.
You mentioned that, in addition to this growing power of China in Vietnam, Japan is also a very heavy investor and contractor for infrastructure in Vietnam. And this is true for some African countries too. And many African countries would dearly like to attract more Japanese involvement. Can you talk a little bit about how Vietnam has managed to straddle that line between the two, and how they managed to pull in so much Japanese investment while also pulling in so much Chinese investment?
Well, the Japanese have been present in the region since the 1960s and 70s. Vietnam, of course, at the time was in the midst of civil war, but during the Vietnam War years, Japanese factories moved into places like Malaysia, Thailand, to a certain extent Indonesia, and it made Southeast Asia sort of the factory floor of Japanese capital. And so, Japan had a lot of interest in, promoting the integration of the region, and it did this through, primarily through the medium of the Asian Development Bank, which Japan has a lot of control over. So, a lot of the, the Greater Mekong Subregion program was formulated by the ADB at the end of the Cold War, with the idea of sort of bringing prosperity to a region that had experienced these horrible conflicts. And at that point, you see, the Japanese government and the ADB funding a lot of projects designed to link together the nations of mainland Southeast Asia, particularly. And so, this program actually is one of the things that has increased China's integration with the nations to its south. It's also helped Vietnam to link itself to its neighbors directly to the west. So, there's an economic corridor under construction now running from Vietnam, the ports of Vietnam, westwards toward Thailand and Myanmar. The idea of sort of knitting together a region that, that with fairly rugged geography that once kept nations from being able to trade with each other via land. And so, I think that Japan's interest in Vietnam has been driven by its commercial interests. In more recent times, there's also been a very conscious attempt to offer an alternative to China, and Vietnam and Japan does the most, I think, to meet the challenge that China presents on its own terms. I mean, we're talking about the construction of large-scale infrastructure along very similar lines to the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, it's interesting because here in Ho Chi Minh City, where I am, the Japanese are building the subway. And then up in Hanoi, the capital, it's the Chinese who are building the subway. And I think the lesson here for African countries is that you can partner with more than one country to build these large-scale infrastructure projects. And this is a great case study for how to do that. Also, incidentally, you talked about public opinion of the Chinese. It's definite, from the peasant to the president, all the way up from a 1-year-old to a 99-year-old. There's nobody here who thinks positively of the Chinese. I mean, anti-Chinese sentiment runs deep, deep in the veins here. And that goes back because of 1,000 years or 1,500 years of history there. But at the same time, interestingly enough, public opinion surveys of the Japanese in this country are very, very high, and across ASEAN as well. So something to look out there as well. Let's go to Thailand. And in Thailand, you talked about how this is, a very interesting country who has, again, a complex relationship with China. It depends on the Chinese for tourism, investment, for business increasingly right now. But you talked about the bamboo that blows in the wind and bends both ways, because at the same time, Thailand is a key outpost for the United States as well. And yet the Thais have been able to manage relations with both the United States and with China quite effectively. And I love that bamboo metaphor that you talked about. Tell us about how Thailand manages it.
Well, Thailand has, historically shown a great deal of, flexibility in how it manages its foreign relations. It's been very good at balancing outside powers against each other and accommodating, the regional hegemon to a certain extent. This was a country that collaborated heartily with the Imperial Japan during World War II, and then, quickly, was able to avoid any real punishment for that, which is something that the British at the time were pushing for, and was quickly able to refashion itself as a Cold War ally of the United States. We see a similar sort of deft adjustment to the rise of China, which, I think, one of the things that is different from Thailand in comparison to Vietnam is that it doesn't share a direct border with China, and so it lacks the friction that direct border often produces. There's also been large-scale migration of ethnic Chinese into Thailand, which is further, and they've intermarried for hundreds of years and make up large parts of the Thai business and political elite today. And that's also softened the sense of difference between China and Thailand. The two nations often describe themselves using family metaphors. Now, a lot of this is sort of, diplomatic niceties, but there is a migratory connection going back hundreds of years. Many of the ethnic Thai peoples originated in southern China, and they still have cousins that die in Yunnan province today. So there are, these connections that have linked the two regions and have really softened the fears that you see, or that you see in places like Vietnam. I think that the Thai commercial elite have benefited greatly from business with China, and the country has shown itself to be quite adept in using China to its own benefit. I mean, but Thailand has also subtly held the line in instances in which it has been concerned that Chinese initiatives were not, serving its interests. And one of the interesting things about Thailand is that there's, the rail project that's currently under construction, supposedly funded by, being built by China. The Thai government refused to take Chinese loans for the construction of this. They're funding it themselves. And this speaks to the leverage I think that countries can have, when they have a decent sized economy, and they have, a certain amount of, a robust economy and a fairly, capable military, they're able to set the terms of their engagement with China in a way that the smaller neighbors like Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar have, had a more difficulty in doing. So I think, Thailand really, as the sort of economic powerhouse, at least, Vietnam is gaining on them quickly, but, it's traditionally been the most powerful nation of mainland Southeast Asia. And it's been able to, engage with China in ways, very purposefully in ways that benefit it. And that, of course, has introduced strains in its traditional alliance with the United States.
Following up on that, what were some of these strains, and how did Thailand manage it?
The alliance between Thailand and the United States was basically a Cold War alliance. The two nations had a strong shared interest in preventing communist subversion and expansion. Of course, that referred to the Soviet Union, but predominantly to China, which loomed just over, only 100 kilometers from Thailand's northern border. And of course, China was backing a communist insurgency in Thailand that sought the overthrow of the monarchy and then the establishment of communist state, as in Vietnam. So the two nations were united by that. At the end of the Cold War, things enter a period of apparent drift. And I think that a lot of the tensions that have arisen have been a result of the American reaction to the course of Thai domestic politics. And of course, this will be something familiar, in Africa, that the question of human rights and political freedoms has created tensions between the United States and the Thai government. There's this sort of sense that the U.S., when it criticizes Thailand, for a military coup or for, repression of peaceful protesters, that it's treating the Thai government like a colonial state, and that there's this sort of resentment that comes out, this Thai nationalism, which is easily sort of prompted. And that's something that's, created, a sense of sort of mild alienation, I suppose. It's no longer quite clear that the two nations have fully congruent interests, and Thailand benefits a lot from trade and investment from China, especially when one considers the dominance of large ethnic Chinese conglomerates in Thailand today, which have to do a lot of business with China. And so, there's sort of an increasing tension over Thailand's, warmth towards China, and also the friction that comes with, these perceived slights to Thai sovereignty.
Yeah, that's a feeling I think a lot of African countries probably can relate with quite well. So let's move south now down to Singapore. And Singapore in many ways is a standout from the rest of ASEAN. At the beginning of the show, I talked about how per capita income in ASEAN is about $4,000. But at the end of the day, that is not what it is in Singapore. Singapore is the most developed country in all of ASEAN. It's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It's one of the most expensive cities in the world, if not the most expensive city in the world. But it's had to navigate in very tough waters. This is a tiny dot of a country at the end of the Malaysian peninsula. And Kishore Mahbubani, who's a famous thought leader, former Singaporean minister, you quoted him in your book, and you said that you quoted him talking about Qatar and how Qatar offered Singapore a very important lesson on managing great power relationships. And he said that small states should behave like small states. What did he mean by that?
Well, I think he meant, reading between the lines, that that Singapore should not stick its neck out in criticizing China. And that it's worth noting that article that he wrote, that I quoted from, prompted a huge pushback from the Singaporean foreign policy establishment. And they actually made the opposite argument, that Singapore has always, Singapore's credibility lies in the fact that it has been willing to stand up to powerful countries, including the United States in some instances, when its interests are transgressed. I argue in the book that Singapore has always drawn the line of its interests very firmly. It has, I think, probably one of the most capable foreign policy establishments of any ASEAN country. It also has the benefit of being able to of a bit of strategic follow through. Given the sort of institutional stability of Singapore under the PAP, it's the country that's probably been best able to set a strategic course and hold to it over the long term. And that strategic course has been based around, a strong military deterrent to prevent outside powers from picking a fight with tiny Singapore. They call it the poisonous shrimp doctrine, that you might be able to swallow us, but we're going to make you very ill. And they've also invested very heavily in multilateral diplomacy. I think the idea of just sort of like creating as many threads as you can that will potentially add up to a cushion that will prevent or forestall conflict between the great powers. And it really is one of the only country in the world that can boast a special relationship with both the United States and China. It's quite a remarkable balancing act. But like the rest of the region, it finds itself increasingly, pressed from both sides by this increasing superpower competition. And the Singaporeans, I think, have been best at articulating a common Southeast Asian position on U.S.-China rivalry. And they've, Prime Minister Lee has had strong words for both powers, and his basic line is, you two have to work this out. Both nations have unrealistic expectations of the other, and it's time for them to reach some sort of an accommodation. And of course, that's elicited that's created tensions with both the United States and China to a certain extent. So Singapore's balancing act is going to be tested in the years to come.
Cobus, we don't hear that kind of pushback from African countries towards the great powers. We hear that they say they don't want to be caught in the middle, but almost in a very passive way. But the way that Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong in Singapore is really like sitting down both of them and pointing his finger and saying, don't bring us into this. Do you see comparisons between what we're hearing out of Southeast Asia in terms of how they're negotiating with the two great powers in Africa as well?
A little bit, so some relating to tech, particularly. I think both these sharp pushbacks from both President Ramaphosa from South Africa and leaders in Kenya on these issues. But I think generally, I think they don't find themselves in a position, as relatively powerful as Singapore. Kind of as with that level of geographic importance and economic importance. So so I think even if they say it, they might not be heard.
Yeah, but we never see pushback towards the Chinese. It's very easy to push back towards the Americans, but never towards the Chinese.
Yeah. Kind of, I think Africa is a little bit newer in that game than Southeast Asia. So I think they're kind of holding back, I think, at the moment. So Sebastian, there was in recently a year or two ago, there was this kind of interesting controversy in South Africa around. This white opposition politician traveled to Singapore, and she said that look, Singapore managed to get its development up to the level it has, among others, because because of the influence of British colonialism, and the kind of there was this this is basically this kind of subtext in there that that the South Africans are taking the history of colonialism too seriously, and then also that there was a subtle kind of subtweet maybe in there about the level of closeness between South Africa and China, and so I wanted to ask you, and then this created like a firestorm of controversy. Like it's a controversy that basically still goes on, because South Africa has such a kind of fraught relationship with both colonialism and then post-colonial racism. So I wanted to ask you, like, how in your mind, where does the kind of this kind of influence on Singapore's growth lie in relation to historical European connections versus newer Chinese connections?
Well, I mean, Singapore is really sui generis. I mean, there's no power that's in at least in Southeast Asia, which has been able to approach its success in transforming itself economically. I do think that the official Singapore story, of from third world to first, to quote the title of Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs, overstates the extent to which Singapore was, a fishing village in 1965 when it was expelled from the Malaysian Federation and gained its independence. It was in the 1930s, one of the great cities of the British Empire, and so it had always functioned as an imperial node for the British Empire, and was always a busy port, which is of course what drew millions of ethnic Southern Chinese to Singapore, and of course they today make up the majority of the population, their descendants. And so, but Singapore has also been, it's recognized that the reemergence of China is a great economic opportunity, and it's trimmed its sails to try and catch that wind. And there was unofficial connections between leaders from the two countries long before they officially established diplomatic relations in 1990. And so there has been, there's been a lot of economic interaction between the two countries. And that's, I think that, in some ways Singapore has benefited from the bequests of British colonialism, but its leaders have also been quite canny in playing the cards that they were dealt. Singapore also faced a lot of challenges given its exposed position, its small size, its lack of natural resources, and the fact that it functioned basically as an ethnic Chinese island in a Malay, predominantly Muslim sea. And of course, I don't want to get too deep into this because it's a complex issue, but the view of ethnic Chinese in that part of the world is fraught, to say the least. And so, Singapore had to be very careful how it established relations with China. This is the reason it didn't establish relations until 1990. That the Singaporeans said they would be the last member of ASEAN to do so, because they didn't want to. They wanted to sort of downplay the idea that Singapore was sort of a Chinese city, and of course, this is now looming as one of the greatest points of tension in its relationship with the People's Republic of China, which also persists in viewing Singapore as a Chinese city or a Chinese country.
Well, Singapore is located on the Malaysian peninsula, so let's just head up across the border to Malaysia, where one of two of the most fascinating characters in ASEAN are located. That is 93-year-old, I think now, Prime Minister 95-year-old. Oh my God, the man will never die. Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, who is now on his second tour as the leader of Malaysia.
No, he resigned last year, so he's now trying to get himself a third term.
A third term. Okay, so he was there, he came back, now he wants to come back again. But he is a very colorful character. In many ways, he reminds me of John Magufuli in Tanzania, who has also struck a very, very hard line with the Chinese on infrastructure financing, but at the same time has, multiple sides of his personality. So let me just kind of bring everybody back to 2018. Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad coming back into power, he targeted his opponent on the funding of a $20 billion railway called the East Coast Rail Link project. And if I remember the attack precisely, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Sebastian, that he said only a drunkard would take it, I think, or something to that extent. And he had this very colorful language saying that the Chinese were ripping off the Malaysians. They were going to become a colony of Malaysia. Now, this aroused a lot of excitement among the anti-China hawks in the United States, who kind of said, see, there's a break in it. Here's the Belt and Road is really just a scam. It's really all kind of falling apart. And then a lot of people started to say, well, wait a minute. Is that really what he means? Because as soon as he came into power, he turned to the Chinese very effectively. Cobus, who does that remind you of in Zambia?
Michael Sata.
That's right. So this is a tried and true technique. He pushed Beijing, Sebastian, and then Beijing came back and met him halfway and brought down the price of the railroad from $20 billion down to $14 or $15 billion. What is the lesson here from Mahathir Mohamad?
I think there's a couple of lessons. I think the first is that, countries have a certain amount of agency in how they engage with things like the Belt and Road Initiative. China has a lot to gain from countries signing on to this thing. And so they do have leverage. Now, not every country has equal leverage, obviously. If we look at a country like Laos, which is, arguably the country in Southeast Asia which is facing the greatest debt problems of any due to Chinese loans. But, this shows that there is, a certain degree to which, the recipient nations are helping to shape the Belt and Road. I think the other thing is that this shows is that, that countries that have, that are institutionally sound, that have, checks and balances, that are accountable, are more likely to be able to use the Belt and Road and benefit from it, rather than sort of, taking on too much debt and creating white elephant projects. I mean, the East Coast Rail Link is a really good example of this. I mean, that was approved by the government of Prime Minister Najib Razak, who who Mahathir's coalition defeated in 2018. Now, of course, Prime Minister Najib was linked to the radioactive, globe-spanning corruption scandal connected to the 1MDB sovereign wealth fund. Now, most people have probably heard of this, but 1MDB involved the theft of an estimated $4 billion by close associates of the prime minister, and the prime minister is alleged to have, received $600 million odd in his personal bank account, and he's currently on trial for in his involvement in this corruption scandal. But basically, when the East Coast Rail Link was approved, he was under a huge amount of pressure, not just domestically, but also internationally. His relations with the United States were torpedoed by the 1MDB revelations. He found himself on the defensive. And as it later turned out, the Wall Street Journal reported that, the East Coast Rail Link, the price of this was actually artificially inflated to, allow the Malaysian government to cream off some money to help pay off some of the 1MDB debts. And so, there was, this was a clear example of China, opportunistically taking advantage of a leader's, domestic troubles. Now, if he hadn't have been in that position to begin with, he would have had been in a much better position to negotiate a better deal for his country. And so wherever you see corruption, mismanagement, self-interested elites, and of course I know Africa has a lot of those, as Southeast Asia does, you see China, being able to, push through projects that might not otherwise be viable. You see a similar thing in Sri Lanka with the Hambantota port, which is the paradigmatic instance of debt trap diplomacy, as it's been termed. But this was a patronage project for the Rajapaksa family, and in many ways the reality of that belies the idea that it was sort of a debt trap planted and planned by the Chinese government. Similar with the East Coast Rail Link, I think.
Kenya faces a similar kind of issue, also a big Chinese-funded rail project that ended up having been inflated artificially to enrich officials, it seems, and is now politically quite unpopular. Are there lessons from Southeast Asia and Malaysia, maybe particularly, that Africans can take in renegotiating those projects, or kind of getting out from under them in some kind of way?
Well, I think you just need capable leadership. And I think one of the problems that we see in Southeast Asia, as in Africa, is that a lot of these nations are very young. I mean, they attained their independence sort of after the end of the Second World War in most cases. And they're still grappling with, the challenges of nation building, a lot of them. And so a lot of them, their attention is drawn inwards. Politics is very, stops at the water's edge, as they say. And, these countries are sort of, politicians are so busy dealing with domestic challenges to their power and maintaining, ethnic relations on an even keel, that it is actually, and issues like corruption and patronage are so ingrained in some Southeast Asian countries that it makes it very difficult for, a government to act, and be consistent in how it, engages with a nation like China, which is offering a lot of money. I mean, the Belt and Road is very attractive for corrupt elites in Southeast Asia, as in Africa. And so, I think it's sort of a truism to say that, the better your institutions are, the better, the more democratic, the more accountable your system is, the better chance it has to use China to the nation's benefit. But of course, the question is how you get those institutions and that accountability. And that's, that's again, that's a challenge that also lies at the heart of a lot of Africa's development problems. And it's something without an easy answer, unfortunately.
Let's stay now in the southern part of ASEAN, close by in Indonesia. Interestingly enough, that was one of the key stops in Wang Yi's recent ASEAN tour in Jakarta, where he met with Joko Widodo, the president of Indonesia. Indonesia, for people who are not familiar, is just an absolutely enormous country. It doesn't look like it on a map, but it is the fourth largest country in the world by population. It's the largest Muslim country in the world. It's over 13,000 islands in the archipelago. Is that right? It's just an enormous expanse of a country. A $1 trillion GDP. So it's a very, very big country, but it's had some tensions with China in recent years. And one of them is over a topic that I think a lot of people in West Africa and off the coast of Mozambique will be very familiar with. Illegal fishing is a very big issue. And I'd also like you to address this phrase that comes out of Indonesia of pragmatic equidistance between the two major powers, the United States and China. So illegal fishing and pragmatic equidistance.
Well, I think, the illegal fishing issue is, a lot of nations around the borders of the South China Sea are facing this issue. I mean, part of it is simply China's, huge demand for seafood and fish. Another is the Chinese government's habit of using fishing fleets and Coast Guard vessels to assert its maritime claims. And so what we've seen over the past few years in Indonesia is that the area around the Natuna Islands, which is just inside the southern curve of the 9-dash line.
Let me just stop you there very quickly, because the 9-dash line is probably a new concept for a lot of folks. Can you just talk about what the 9-dash line is and what the dispute in the South China Sea is and how far the points in Indonesia are from the Chinese mainland? Just a little bit of a background on that.
Sure. So in 2009, the Chinese lodged with the UN Commission a map with a huge looping line of 9 dashes, which claims for China sovereignty over the vast majority of the South China Sea. Now, this line extends to within a few dozen miles of the coasts of the Philippines, not much further from the coast of Vietnam, very close to the coast of Borneo, Brunei, and Malaysia, and it cuts off huge percentages of the exclusive economic zones of Southeast Asian nations. Now, the exclusive economic zone is a zone, a 200 nautical mile zone that extends out from a country's coast under international law, under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So China's basically claimed sovereignty over this entire waterway, which sees trillions of dollars worth of global trade transverse it every year. And Indonesia is not a formal claimant state. It doesn't, say that there is a dispute. It's sort of tried to shy away from open confrontation over this issue. But there is a small pocket of Indonesian waters that lie within this 9-dash line. And so China has, of course, sent its Coast Guard vessels and its, and fishing fleets into this area. And there's been increasing sort of, incidents of friction in that area. And this is, been, this has been sort of bubbling along for a number of years now. The Indonesians have been, I think, quite good, as many Southeast Asian claimant states have been, in quarantining the South China Sea disputes from more productive parts of the relationship. And, President Jokowi's government, has, looked to China to provide a lot of the funding for its, it's got a program of infrastructure building that it seeks to sort of, increase connectivity within the Indonesian islands and help boost the region's economy. And it's looked to China for that. And so it's had to tread a very careful line in the South China Sea, as I said, many of the nations have had to do. And so I think that Indonesia illustrates well what I was talking about before about, forging nations from the colonial empires that came before them. I mean, Indonesia was, is a totally artificial concept. I mean, to a large extent, all nations are artificial, but Indonesia, was the one unifying characteristic of Indonesia was that it was all governed by the Dutch. There was no, we can't point to any pre-colonial power whose power extended across the entire Indonesian archipelago. And so nation building has been a very piecemeal and, sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back process for the Indonesian government. I mean, until recently, the government had an active, was fighting an active Muslim insurgency, separatist insurgency in Aceh on the island of Sumatra. It's still fighting, a separatist, a movement in West Papua. And there was also a history of communist insurgency during the Cold War. And so this is a nation which is sort of got a centripetal sort of tendency. The government looks inwards. It has a population of 270 million people that need to be fed and that need jobs. And so the Indonesian government, probably, more than most other Southeast Asian governments, is absorbed with its own development challenges and its own affairs to a large extent. And so it has looked to China for support in that regard. And that's meant that it's had to tread a very careful line when it comes to the question of illegal fishing, which is of course a proxy for the more serious problem of maritime sovereignty claims.
As Eric mentioned, Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim country. We've seen in Africa's majority Muslim countries have been very wary of talking about the situation in Xinjiang, to the extent that several of them have actually come out in support of China's line on that everything is actually the China's line that everything is fine in Xinjiang, and we haven't seen a lot of kind of popular energy among the populations, either in Africa or in the Middle East, on this issue. Is there, like, how is the situation shaking out in Indonesia in relation to Xinjiang?
Well, there's certainly domestic, constituencies that are deeply concerned about this, but I think that most governments in Southeast Asia, Indonesia included, and I would say that this would probably apply to many African governments too, view this basically as a question of national sovereignty over, a question of human rights. And so they are, there's a sort of reciprocal understanding that if we don't criticize them, they won't criticize us. And this is one of the things that I think is most welcome about the way that China does business in Southeast Asia, that it doesn't have this sort of liberal, missionary sort of tendency like a lot of Western countries do, for better or for worse, right? And this is something that, China has lent very heavily on, and this has meant, that this is the reason that Indonesia and Malaysia and Brunei have not spoken out about this question. China has also made a lot of attempts to reach out to, Muslim groups in these countries and sort of, invite them on trips to China where they visit mosques in Inner Mongolia and places like that. And they kind of, they have kind of, lobby them. They donate. They make donations to organizations in these countries, and so there's sort of been a program of soft power program aimed at sort of winning the hearts and minds of individuals within these organizations, and it's been quite successful. I think this points to something quite interesting about the way that China engages. And indeed a contradiction in the way that it engages with the region is that it sort of presents itself, as in Africa, as an anti-colonial, a fellow sort of victim of Western imperial bullying. But at the same time, it's the one former sort of, imperial victim that is now got, something approaching imperial power of its own. And so there's this sort of contradiction at the heart of how China frames itself in that way. And, I think that, this is, this tension, again, lies at the center of Southeast Asia's relationship with China.
Let's close our country tour of Southeast Asia in the Philippines, where, without doubt, there's no competition. The most colorful character on the political scene is President Rodrigo Duterte. I mean, he is charismatic as they come in this part of the world, but he in many ways highlights the complexity of the China-U.S. ASEAN relationship. In the one hand, he's got direct interest in the South China Sea squabble. At the same time, this is a former colony of the United States. And as you pointed out in your book, there is this kind of odd kind of sensation when you're in the Philippines that you really feel like you're in Middle America. It is in the sense that American culture is so pervasive. All your favorite, Chevy dealers are there, McDonald's. It's also one of the poorest countries in the region. But at the same time, President Duterte has really thrown his weight behind the Chinese before quitting the Chinese and then going back to the Chinese. So talk to us about President Duterte and the Philippines' role in all of this.
Duterte, again, he's a very difficult character to read. Shortly after he came to power, one of the things that got him elected was his promise to crack down on drug-related crime and to use. He said he would use violence to quash this problem, a problem that successive governments had failed to address. And within days of entering the presidential palace, the police started fanning out into the slums and shooting dead people, many of them simply drug users or innocents entirely. And Duterte's drug war has now racked up, a massive death toll. And of course, this has been faced with a huge amount of pushback from Western powers, including the United States. And this is one thing that sort of caused Duterte to, turn his back, as he claimed at the time, on the United States, and to embrace powers like China that sort of have this no strings sort of form of engagement. Again, like Jokowi, I mean, he faces a lot of developmental challenges. He came to power like Jokowi as a small town mayor who, had a can-do attitude and promised to get things done. And so he's also turned to China for infrastructure funding. And actually just a few days ago, the two nations signed. This is during Wang Yi's visit to Manila. The two nations signed an agreement to build a railway connecting the two former U.S. military bases at Clark and Subic Bay, which I mentioned in my book, is highly symbolic of how, the balance of power is shifting in the region. But Duterte has, he has tried to, benefit from Chinese largesse. And one of the ways he's done that is been to downplay the tensions in the South China Sea. And of course, just a few months before he took office, the Philippines won a very important arbitral case in the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, which essentially, the Philippines had brought that case in 2013, challenging a lot of China's legal arguments and claims in the South China Sea. And the Hague Tribunal ruled in favor of the Philippines on virtually every one of its challenges. Not all of them, but just about all the important stuff. But Duterte set that aside. Instead of using that to build international consensus and build pressure on China, he basically abandoned it and said, look, this confrontation has gotten us nowhere. I'm going to make friends with Xi Jinping, and we're going to, the country's going to benefit from this, from Chinese largesse. He's also a Mindanaoan. He's from the south of the Philippines, a region that saw, American atrocities during the War of Pacification at the early part of the 20th century when the U.S. conquered the Philippine Islands. And so he also is sort of, is part of the small minority of Filipinos who are highly critical of the United States for its imperial past in the Philippines. And, as you suggested, Eric, this is a country that is in some ways more pro-American than the United States is itself. But there is a small and vocal constituency that, has sort of bucked against this sort of smothering quasi-colonial relationship that's persisted since independence in 1946. And Duterte has sort of given voice to a lot of these anti-American tropes, and I think the criticisms of his drug war have simply played into those resentments. It's led the Philippines into a very strange position where, the vast majority of the security and political establishment is as pro-American as any in the region, if not more. Yet the leader is someone who, given the peculiarities of the Philippine political system, has had a huge amount of power to wrench the country's foreign policy toward China. And arguably, there is a need for the Philippines to establish a better balance between the two powers in an era of increasing competition. I mean, the Philippines could well be the front line of a conflict if one was to break out on the South China Sea. However, Duterte's foreign policy, has lurched from one extreme to the other, and it's very hard to sort of find any sort of consistent thread that you can follow.
In Africa, one frequently sees that the historical story of China's development, that itself as such power, kind of as a kind of a factor in convincing leaders to work with China. Just simply this fact of the hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty in such a short time, and it has a lot of kind of traction against Western criticisms of China as well. Do you see that same kind of dynamic in places like the Philippines, or is the fact that they're so much closer to China, does that kind of complicate the story?
Well, I think there's a certain amount of admiration. It's hard not to be impressed by the rapidity of China's economic growth. I think that a lot of it just has to do with proximity and the corollary, which is economic entanglement. I mean, China is now the most important economic partner to every nation in the region. It's not the top trading partner of everyone, but just about. And it's, as you mentioned, ASEAN is China's number one trade partner now, and so the region has a huge amount to gain from a stable and prosperous China. And a China that was in a state of decline or internal collapse or civil war, as has happened obviously through the grand sweep of Chinese history, would be terrible for the region. And a lot of people recognize that. The last, when dynasties have fallen in China, that's very often led to refugees washing up on the shores of Southeast Asian countries or trickling down through the mountains into Myanmar and Thailand. And they've had a hugely destabilizing effect, during these periods. And so, I do think that there's a sort of a mix of sort of this anti-colonial sort of residues in both regions. You have the success that China's had in developing its own economy, and you have just the fact that the economic ties are already so thick between these two regions that that there's it incentivizes the region to sort of maintain good relations and continue that that upward trajectory.
We started on a question about the big picture, and I like to close on a question on the big picture. You've walked us through a number of the countries. Your book takes us through all the details of it. Let's say you were invited to the African Union to meet with a group of presidents, prime ministers, and senior level officials. They would say, Sebastian, you have been studying what the Chinese have been doing in a fragmented part of the world, and they've been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. We are relatively new to dealing with the Chinese and also, with this new standoff with the United States. What would be the advice that you would give those presidents and prime ministers of the African Union on how to better manage their relationship with China?
Well, it's a very complex question. I mean, I think one advantage that Africa has is that it's not in China's backyard, so it doesn't need to engage with China. It can say no. It can walk away from the table. And so I think that the region, probably could do a lot more. And I would say to these leaders that, you should do a lot more to determine exactly what your development needs are and try and, shape engagement more proactively. Now, I am not familiar enough with Africa to know if this is something that is being done, and if so, where. But I think that it's a challenge for a lot of the nations of Southeast Asia to do that. I mean, again, post-colonial nations with unresolved conflicts or internal ethnic strife. Other nation-building challenges, all of these things, distract the attention of leaders and make it more difficult to sort of formulate consistent development strategies, even leaving aside the question of China. And China is a very powerful partner. It's got a lot of money. It's eager to invest. It's eager for allies. But I think that, I would say, try and set the terms of your engagement with it, and also try to maintain a healthy balance in your foreign relations. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. But I think a lot of that depends on things being sorted out on the home front. And I think that if a nation is corrupt and mismanaged, that is only going to make it easier that'll tend to, in those situations, you'll see the most negative impacts of Chinese investment, as indeed we have in Southeast Asia.
Sebastian Strangio is the author of the book In the Dragon's Shadow, Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century. Pretty much everybody in the China watching space listed it as one of the top China books of 2020. I can't recommend it enough. You can get the audiobook, the Kindle version, the hard copy, you can get them all. So go to Amazon or wherever you buy your books and you can check it out. I highly recommend it, even if you are not in Southeast Asia or even interested in Southeast Asia. But again, what we're trying to do is see, are there lessons that can be extracted about how the Chinese and to some extent the United States are engaging these reasons so that they can be applied to other parts of the world, places like Africa. Sebastian, if people want to follow what you're reading and writing in addition to your work at The Diplomat, where can they find you online?
Well, I'm on Twitter at Strangio. And I've also got a website, www.sebastianstrangio.com, where I post some of my articles, and at thediplomat.com I blog regularly on Southeast Asian politics and current affairs. And so people can go to either of those, or any of those three, to read some more of my work.
Excellent. I'll put links to all of that in the show notes of the show. Sebastian, thank you so much for staying up late for us in Australia. We really appreciate it. And we'd love to have you back on the show again soon.
Thanks. It was my pleasure.
Cobus, the parallels between ASEAN and Africa and their relationship, both with China and the United States, again, they're very different regions. I don't want to oversimplify the similarities, but there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from what's been going on in this region, simply because they've been doing it for so much longer. One of the key takeaways, though, and we didn't have time to really go into it with Sebastian, but the countries here know they can't get away without having a very cogent, coherent China policy. They know what they want out of China. That was the lesson for me looking at what Mahathir was doing. You see Duterte's moving back and forth in the Philippines all the time. Vietnam thinks endlessly about its engagement with China. And it's one of the topics that you and I have talked about, that China has now, it doesn't have an Africa policy anymore. It has a Kenya policy, a Nigeria policy, and a viewpoint on South Africa, and it's at the country level. That is not as refined from the African point of view towards China. That there is not as refined a South African view as to what they want out of the BRI, what they want out of China specifically, how they're going to manage the relationship between the United States, China, Europe, Japan, all of them. And in many ways, it's still that these foreign policies in Africa are oriented towards London, Brussels, and Washington, still. And that is, to me, the biggest lesson out of Southeast Asia, that these countries really are focused on Beijing.
Yeah, I agree. China is just a permanent fixture on their landscape, which I think it is starting to become in Africa as well. But as you say, there's a lot of capacity is lacking, and also a lot of cultural knowledge. I think it's really important. I think for African diplomats to just know more about Asia, not just about China, but about all of the kind of Asian actors. Because they are going to be Africa's main trading economic other partners over the next few years. I think I don't foresee a massive kind of rush back of European or American power into Africa. I just don't think that's where the attention lies in Europe and the US at the moment.
Well, that's why I was very excited when I saw the news that South Africa is engaging ASEAN as a partner. In my supermarket here, I get now South African wines, there's South African citrus, South African products are showing up on the shelves now. So that's exciting because it's a new market for South Africa. These are burgeoning markets. It also will reduce some of the dependency on the China market, which is a really acute problem in a number of countries, that they feel boxed in because China is their largest trading partner. And as a result of that, there is leverage that comes with it, or the perception of leverage. That being said, Cobus, Mohammed Mahathir really demonstrates that you can push back. Michael Sata demonstrated that you can push back. And I think that there would be some benefit in African leaders really pushing back, again, along the lines of what John Magufuli did with the Bagamoyo port in Tanzania, where he did push back. That port deal still hasn't come through. And it's not necessarily a binary thing that if you push back hard and you negotiate tough, that your relationship is going to fracture with the Chinese and they'll walk away and go somewhere else. I think there's a lesson there that from some of these Southeast Asian countries and how they've negotiated some of their deals with the Chinese. Last key point here in Vietnam, as I mentioned in the show, the ability to work with multiple partners at the same time. Again, the Koreans, the Japanese, and the Chinese are all very active here in both the development and in the investment space. And I think that also makes for a healthier environment as well, is that if we saw big infrastructure projects from the Japanese and at the same time, say, the Turks or the Chinese together in a place like Kenya, to me would be healthier than if it's just predominantly the Chinese.
Yes, and I think many African leaders would agree with you, and we see in several countries more work trying to kind of to pull these in. Of course, each of those relationships need a particular kind of set of work, a particular set of skills, diplomatic expertise, and so on, and those are lacking on the ground in Africa. But I think in general terms, like everyone would agree that that more partners are better. That you need to work the established partners and the new ones, and then that you need to be open to doing different things with different people. And I think in the process there, that then actually makes the relationship with China more valuable rather than less valuable.
And that may organically happen now in the years ahead, simply because the amount of Chinese development financing is going down. The Chinese are not spending the way that they were over the past 10 years. So that will all open up opportunities for other players to come into the market and for African stakeholders to reach out to other countries to engage on development finance and infrastructure construction. So we may actually see that happen organically. So listen, we went a little bit longer in our show today than we normally do. I always hate going over an hour because I feel like it abuses the listeners' time and your time, which is so precious. So if you've made it this far in the show, we really do appreciate it. Also, we want to invite you to join us in our community of readers that we communicate to every day through our email newsletter. Subscriptions start just at $7 for students and teachers, $15 for everybody else. But we cover everything in the China-Africa space and increasingly now in the China Global South space, where what we're doing is we're connecting what the Chinese are doing in the Americas, in Arabia, in Asia, and also, of course, in Africa together in all of those different regions. So about half the newsletter now is about Africa, and the other half is about the rest of the Global South. So it's a very, very interesting rundown every single day that comes straight into your inbox at 6 a.m. Washington time. So go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe and sign up for a subscription. We'd love for you to be a part of our community of readers. And of course, if you have any questions whatsoever, you can reach out directly to myself at Eric, ERIC, at ChinaAfricaProject.com or Cobus, COBUS, at ChinaAfricaProject.com. And of course, you can find us on all of our various social media channels, which the lovely lady will tell you at the end of the show on where to find them. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. For Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander. We'll see you again next week.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. Or follow the guys on Twitter. Eric's at Eolanda, and you can find Cobus at Stadenesque. For more information about the China Africa Project and to sign up for our free weekly email news brief, go to ChinaAfricaProject.com.